We will be focusing on the Nigerian economy, and joining us from London for an exclusive interview is the former Central Bank Governor, Professor Charles Soludo. Professor Charles Soludo, it's great to have you on the show today.
It's really a great pleasure. I'm glad to be here. I mean,
All right.
they tried to get me in Nigeria, but that couldn't work.
Well, it's great we have you finally. And we really want to focus on the economy and your thoughts on what we're seeing. Clearly, the latest GDP numbers give somewhat of a worrying sense of where we are headed as an economy. The Q1 GDP was down to 6.17%. I want to get your thoughts on where the economy is headed and how you see things.
Well, three quick comments. The first is that I still believe the Nigerian economy is one of a land of opportunities, an economy with huge potentials. I believe that Nigeria today is like a supersonic computer, but that is being used only for word processing. So we have huge capacity there, huge potentials, but little being used. That said, the other point is that, well, I saw the GDP numbers first quarter released by the National Bureau of Statistics and the interpretation being given to that. I think in all fairness, the interpretation by the National Bureau of Statistics is, in my view, downright wrong. It's basically an oil story. That's what is in those numbers. The Nigerian economy is tied almost precariously to the life support of the oil sector. And so when you have the oil sector, which accounts for about 15% of GDP, decline by more than 2.3% in the first quarter, and then you have GDP compared to the first quarter of last year, decline from 7.1 something to 6.1 something in the first quarter this year. What you basically find is that if you adjust for the decline in oil output in the first quarter, statistically speaking, there is no difference between the first quarter GDP last year and that of this year. But having said that, it still doesn't distract from the fact that the economy is performing far, 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 far below its potentials, and that the underlying fundamentals of the economy are indeed weak. My assessment is that the longer-term vulnerabilities are increasing strenuously relative to the assets. We seem to be accumulating liabilities faster than we are accumulating assets, and
perhaps
is still largely vulnerable. Yeah.
I was going to say, and perhaps something that's probably putting even more pressure on the economy right now is the interest rate environment. Of course, I'm sure you know that we've seen a very somewhat tight monetary policy stance over the last 1 year. The benchmark NPR is up to 12%. Clearly, that's putting some pressure on the cost of business for quite a few companies. Would you say, though, that the central bank had to make those moves? Or would you say they've gone a little too far? Because clearly, it is putting some pressure on businesses.
Well, you can't control all the prices. You cannot control inflation, control interest rate, and control exchange rate. I mean, one of them has to be an instrument and some others the objectives. Clearly speaking, you got to also ask what's the level of inflation. I mentioned a moment ago about the underlying fundamentals of the economy, which seem not to be adding up. You have all kinds of structural imbalances, and the macroeconomic numbers do not add up. That's the kind of thing that you're going to find. If you have government borrowing at 12, 13%, that's what you got the Treasury bill rate. When the government borrowing at those kinds of high rates, what do you then expect the monetary policy rate to be? What's the rate of inflation? I mean, there is an issue of, I mean, you can't eat your cake and have it back. If the government is doing all the spending and all the borrowing, then for the macroeconomic numbers to add up, the private sector is being crowded out, speaking in economic terms. So once you make that decision at the parliament, at the level of the executive and the parliament, about the spending plan and the borrowing plans, those decisions cannot go independent of the other. If the government decides to spend more and borrow more, then invariably it has also made a decision to squeeze out the private sector. It's just basic economics.
All right, let's take a look back at the stance of the current central bank leadership with regards to the banking sector. Clearly, we've seen a lot of reforms. I mean, while you were governor, there was certainly a very strong sense of reform, of course, with the consolidation of the sector, increasing capitalization requirements for banks. But now we've seen a new thinking around that, and now we're seeing new capital requirements for different types of banking businesses. We're now having regional banks, we're having merchant banks having different requirements. What are your thoughts on the changes we've seen with regards to the banking regulatory environment?
Well, I have to say two things. First is that change and reforms happen to be everyday occurrence in every institution. Every organization will continue to undergo reforms. But I must say that in Nigeria, I mean, in terms of thoughts here, I think what has been happening for me happened to be complementing what we had done in some sense. Fundamentally, in the last 20 years in Nigeria, the Nigerian economy has had hundreds of reforms, but there have been two policy revolutions that have so fundamentally changed the structures of the economy and the long-term performance of that economy. The first happened to be the telecom revolution, and the second happened to be the banking sector consolidation. And no matter what happens, I mean, it's there. I mean, it's writing on the marble. We now have, through the banking sector consolidation, we've been able to create a fundamentally different banking and financial system in Nigeria. And through the Financial System Strategy 2020, we also bequeathed a strategy for the future, I mean, to get Nigeria to become Africa's financial hub and so on, which encapsulate all ramifications of Nigeria's financial system. The capital market, the credit market, the mortgage, every sector of the financial system is actually encapsulated in that vision and the master plan for the financial system. So the reforms about whether you have regional banks.
Professor Soludo, if I can jump in at this point, I really want to get your thoughts on the growth rate of the banking sector, because some people say that is part of the problem. Obviously, you know, we've had a crisis up to 2009, and we've clearly seen major reforms since then. But some think that the consolidation that we had in 2004, 2005 forced the banks to grow way too fast, and they didn't have the proper risk management framework to manage that growth, and we got into trouble. Would you agree?
I think absolutely. Well, maybe 5% of that could be true. I said that publicly last week, that the kind of revolution and the quantum leap in size in the financial system, including the capital market. The new capital market happened to be one of the byproducts of the consolidation from 1.9 trillion that I met it when I assumed office to over 13 trillion that it went as high as 2008. And of course, the banks in quantum leap. And we also, as part of the consolidation agenda, introduced risk management and risk-based supervision. That's part of our 13-point agenda. We were also undertaking training for senior staff of banks and central bank on risk management and risk-based supervision and so on, even while I was there. So no question, there was some shortage of skills, but that was being ratcheted up. But I must say, that's about 5% of the explanation as to what has happened to the banking sector, or some of the banks that took excessive risks. Obviously, just like everywhere else in the world, you couldn't say there weren't enough risk management and so on at Lehman Brothers and many of the banks in America that collapsed. That was a global shock, and our banking sector faced 4 interrelated and unexpected shocks that came on them. And you must say, part of the story that has to be told someday is how we managed to rescue the entire banking and financial system of Nigeria from total collapse in the face of an unprecedented global crisis that was never anticipated by anybody, and without any bank going down, such that Nigerian economy avoided having a recession.
All right, very good point.
That's a story for another day. That's a story for another day, yeah.
Indeed. But a quick point, I just want to get your thoughts, if you want to add your voice to what the IMF are saying around calls for amendment to the CBN Act and some threats to the autonomy of the central bank. What are your thoughts on that point, very quickly?
I think, quite frankly, for me, it's really very sad development. I think it will be a very sad day for the Nigerian economy if those amendments pass. The way I read them now, they occur to me to really be a legislation in anger, as it were. And the question I think the National Assembly should be asking is, what kind of central bank do we want for our children and grandchildren to inherit? I think there are better ways of achieving what they want to achieve. You don't, as the proverb in my language says, you don't, because of the irritation of rats in your house, set your entire house ablaze. There are better ways of doing it, ensuring greater transparency and accountability without necessarily ruining the institution itself.